The airport sector is popular for infrastructure investors, and in recent years, greenfield development as well as airport M&A has picked up as investors recognise the quality of assets available within the global airport sector. TFI News met with Rob Rushmer, director at LeighFisher, to discuss the sector. I asked Rob where the true value was in buying an airport and the key factors that contribute to a good investment.
I think there's a number of reasons that drive value in an airport acquisition. It's largely a statement of the obvious. But I think over the last few years, perhaps what we've seen is a hierarchy of the airports that are most attractive to the market. The most attractive would be a hub airport. Very few of those obviously come up for sale. The sale of BAA was obviously one of the largest in recent times. I'm talking about the sale to Ferrovial. Obviously over the last couple of years there's been talk of Spanish airports, and most recently of course there's talk of the sale of Lisbon, which would be very attractive. They're very few and far between because of their very nature. There are few airports of that type, no more than one per country, if that. Outside of a hub airport, an airport with a strong outbound market would then be the preferred as a regional airport, of which Edinburgh is a very good example. And I think that's helping quite significantly to drive what we are led to believe potentially strong valuations of the Edinburgh sale. And then very much bottom of the pecking order in terms of attractiveness are airports that are really dependent upon an inbound market, because that's very easily substitutable, and is dependent upon other economies to drive the throughput of the asset, making it, in most people's eyes, quite a risky investment.
Now, have we seen during a recession a clear separation now on the performance of hub and regional airports, with the biggest drops in traffic being experienced by regional airports?
To some extent, I think that's probably correct. It's interesting to see that I think different airports have performed differently, again, depending upon the characteristics of their individual business case. So taking some of those previous examples, Heathrow had a downturn, but has just delivered its best ever year. Stansted suffered quite badly as a direct consequence of its based airlines, the needs of their business case, the price sensitivity of the business case of the airlines and their passengers, and Stansted's unique position in the pecking order of London airports. Whereas Edinburgh, for example, performed much better. Traffic did downturn, but nowhere near to the same extent, helped sustained somewhat by a reasonably strong domestic business case at the airport.
Looking at UK airport policy, and asking for a concise answer on this as well, where do you think we're heading now with this and the debate on the third runway for Heathrow?
Yes, it's an important and very current question, isn't it? I think the simple answer is hopefully we are heading towards a constructive debate on third runway at Heathrow. We don't need to go perhaps too much over the last few years and the political changes from the previous government, which was supportive of additional capacity in the southeast, did not necessarily rule out capacity at Heathrow, and then latterly in the last government's term was supportive of a third runway at Heathrow. The new government, we can argue for the reasons behind this, then made some very clear statements about its view of third runway, reflected and indeed differently reflected by the mayoral candidates in London, for example. And I think what Boris has done, Boris Johnson to perhaps call him correctly, has sought to put Heathrow back on the agenda. And whilst we might have personal opinions of the merits of third runway at Heathrow, and to a degree that would depend upon where one lives in London and the South East, at least including it as part of the debate, so that if I can use the phrase, the needs of the many are considered against the needs of the few, and the needs of a joined up multimodal transport policy is considered in the completeness, then it is appropriate that the third runway at Heathrow is considered as part of that mix. That's not to forejudge what the conclusion would be, but it has to be considered as one of the potential alternatives.
Looking at the deal pipeline for investors now, where do you see the next deals originating from? Will it be governments forced to privatise airport assets, or is it going to be more from private transactions?
I think probably The straightforward answer is a blend of the two. The immediate pipeline is perhaps more around governments selling, or at least governments being required to sell reluctantly. We might conclude in a number of occasions. For example, the sale, which has been often talked about in Spain, the sale which is currently back on the agenda and has been said to be this year in Portugal, the sales in Ireland which are currently off the agenda. Russia has said it's going to sell a number of regional airports. Even Japan has said it's going to sell a number of regional airports. These are all government-led sales, but with a degree of reluctance. It's not obvious that the governments are doing it because of a firm political belief that this is the correct approach, more of a short-term need to readdress some of the problems of the last few years. And I think what's then going to be interesting, if we look slightly longer term, over the remainder of this decade and certainly into the next decade, is some of the earlier concession agreements will start to come up for renewal, which is not something we've really seen in the market to this point, where concessions have been let over the last 10, 15, perhaps 20 years, with 20, 30 plus durations, and therefore this is a market we've not come across where governments will be taking back concessions and retendering them. So there will be some aspects of that over the coming decade or so, as well as some of the more private-to-private sales that you mentioned, examples being TAV at the moment and Hochtief at the moment, both of which, of course, have struggled in the immediate term because of the valuation that the potential buyers have put on buying what are perceived as perhaps distressed assets at this moment.
Looking at the health of the airlines, obviously oil is a major issue, travellers' constrained budgets, current argument with the EU emissions trading compliance regime for overseas airlines using EU airspace. What's your take now on the current health of the airlines?
Yes, again, it's quite a mixed story, isn't it? I think that a number of the more established carriers have retrenched and consolidated. They've cut volume to focus upon yield, and that has perhaps paid dividends, and they're starting to see perhaps a turnaround and an increase in traffic. Early days, but there's perhaps grounds for confidence that the market is starting to improve there. That then needs to be compared with some other airlines, smaller airlines in Europe, and for example Kingfisher in India come to mind, where the market has proved difficult. One can argue that this is perhaps overextending, volume allowed to grow too far at the cost of maintaining a profitable operation. But clearly it remains a difficult market for airlines. Fuel, you mentioned, is clearly an important issue. And of course in the UK the airlines are very concerned about APD and the impact upon their price-conscious customers. It's interesting to see that the four main airlines, who very rarely speak with the same voice, have come together over APD on a number of occasions. The simple fact they've done that speaks volumes about how important they perceive it to be for them.
When airports are high-profile assets, as been witnessed by the BAA, new owners can trigger governments to reassess the regulatory regime in which they operate. What lessons do you think the market has learned to observe from the BAA experience, and can a change of view from a government citing competition issues when a new owner acquires a key asset put off potential investors?
Yes, aviation regulation in the round, I think, is an interesting question, and perhaps one which is still developing, if I can be as kind to put it that way. That many governments, as we were talking previously about, perhaps reluctant sellers, see retaining a degree of regulation and the structure of regulation as being a means of retaining some control over the private investor. We can discuss how attractive that is to a private investor who is looking for freedom, and a brave government would give that investor freedom, give them an attractive model that enables them to maximise their business case, taking the view that if that business case is maximised, then the government's case is equally maximised. For a number of governments, that's quite a difficult ask, where they are quite politically and philosophically opposed to selling what are perceived to be public assets. and therefore seeking to appease their own political needs. This is entirely justified. To retain a degree of control, to retain a degree of public control over what becomes a private asset. Has that lesson been learnt efficiently and effectively worldwide? I'm not clear that it has. We certainly haven't seen the emergence of one regulatory model which is acknowledged as being the preferred. Each country tends to assess this anew and tends to come up with a different solution, which perhaps argues that there is not a perfect solution. So have the lessons been learned? I mean, I don't think anybody would suggest that the UK government got it entirely correct when BA was privatised, and the current processes around re-establishing or redefining what we mean by UK regulation suggest that it's still very much work in progress in the UK, and it's still very much work in progress in many parts of the world. So have the lessons been learned? Arguably no, and they are still being learnt, and we can hope that an efficient model, there will never be one size fits all, but a number of efficient models depending upon the needs of different governments' political aspirations start to become established.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.